All right, well, let me jump in and make a couple welcoming comments. First of all, thank you to everybody for joining us in our CCA workshop, our bi-weekly one. This is our penultimate meeting. We have one more a few weeks from now with Bronwyn Coate coming in from Down Under, and that'll be wrapping up our academic year schedule. We had such good engagement and turnout for these things, and such great speakers come in. We're really looking forward to setting up the schedule for next year as well. So keep us in your long-term calendar, and make sure you make a note in your short-term calendar for the next time we meet. We'll be meeting at 5 p.m. Eastern, because our speaker's coming from Australia and we're not going to have her talk at noon Eastern. So we'll have a time change for the next time. But for today, we are very lucky to have Lénia Marques come in all the way from Rotterdam to give our presentation and hopefully a really good discussion today. And so this is all about her and what she has to say and what we can contribute. So I'm gonna stop talking and hand the microphone over to Lénia and say thank you for coming all the way in from Erasmus and joining us in our workshop today, Lénia. We'll give you at least 20-30 minutes, I hope, to present, and then we'll have lots of back and forth and discussion, and I'll try to help moderate things. If people put questions in the chat, you're also welcome to monitor it yourself, and we can have people raise their hand and ask questions that way as well. So anyway, welcome to everybody. Thank you all for joining, and without any further ado, here's Lénia Marques.
Yes, thanks, Doug, and hello to everybody. And I'm not alone today, so I am with Ferește Adisatlo. So maybe you want to say hi, Ferește.
Hello. Hi, I'm very honored to be here.
Yes, and thank you for the invite, and I do hope that it will just be, you know, a start of a collaboration between us. And I know that there's already collaborations going on with the Erasmus and your group. So let's say that this is another step. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all of you out there, wherever you are, for joining. And we are looking forward to discuss. I think there's a lot to discuss in the paper that we are presenting. Let's see, can you see it? Some of our slides? Yeah, great. So my name, like you said, is Lénia, and I am working at the Erasmus, and I am an assistant professor of cultural organizations and management. So these topics that are also in our hearts. And the paper we are presenting relates to knowledge and new media art, or more precisely, new media artists. And this was a work that I have supervised with Ferește, or better said, Ferește, who is now a lecturer in Breda University of Applied Sciences. She has done this research, and we have been working on it. And so this is what we would like to share today with you. So maybe Ferește, you can say something about you and say something about the research.
Definitely. Yes, well, as Lénia said, this is a work that I had the fortune to develop when I was doing my master's in Erasmus University Rotterdam. And well, it came out of like my very intrinsic passion about this type of art. And it became very interesting, and I had also the honor to further develop it with Lénia. So that is fantastic. And well, we can start if you're okay with it.
If it works. Yes.
I don't know if I can.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So we're going to start talking about what new media art is. Like perhaps some of you know a little bit about it, but some don't. So this is an artistic practice that emerged in the late 20th century, just as all the different possibilities of digital technologies came along, and first started in university settings, and then it started to go out. Well, but also the name new media art might be a little bit strange, and there has been a lot of discussion about this as well. And there has even been discussion about whether we should be having the discussion about how to name it. But just to give a little bit of context, because perhaps you have heard other terms, well, media art is also a way to call it, and some of the other names that you see on screen. But basically, new media art is an artistic practice that uses technology as a medium, but it also has a reflective approach to the social, the political, and the cultural implications that this use of media brings. And by that, there's an inherent challenge, which is that it requires a continuous acquisition and reconfiguration of both explicit and implicit knowledge for these producers. So the aim of our research was to investigate how knowledge processes, namely creation, transfer, and adoption of knowledge, contribute to the creative collaborative outcomes of these new media artists. And we did this by looking into these three elements. So the explicit and tacit knowledge flows, the strategies for knowledge creation, transfer, and adoption, and the facilitating contexts that allow these processes. And well, now Lénia is going to tell you a little bit more about the theory behind it.
Yes, so when we talk about knowledge, it relates to intangible assets, to operational roots, creative processes. So basically, it's about the new information that is created with ideas, expertise, and also exchanges. And knowledge can be explicit knowledge when it's under a certain structure, when it's, for example, with a document that is written, that can also be transferred and seen in with information technology, and there is definitely a part of rationalization in this process. While tacit knowledge is that kind of hidden information that we can't really put our fingers onto. It's what happens in these exchanges. It's about perceptions, it's about intuitions, emotions, experiences. And so with having in mind these two types of knowledge, we have to consider that this knowledge also occurs in a social sphere where you have formal and informal contexts, where you also have creation, but also the transfer and the adoption of knowledge as processes in this social sphere. So processes such as sharing, interpreting, and combining information are quite important in these knowledge exchange. And networks are fundamental for this to happen. And you can have networks of individuals, collectives, or organizations, and they will interact and create knowledge, search for knowledge, transfer that knowledge, and use that knowledge in different ways. And how this happens is that then we see that there's knowledge flows. And according to Snyder and Neeson in 2003, they have figured out that these knowledge flows can take three forms, let's say. One where knowledge is seen as a solution. So it's really when you are using knowledge to sort out something very specific. The other one is knowledge as an experience. So you really accumulate knowledge into future use in a particular environment. And then you have knowledge as socially created. So where you have different individuals interacting and sharing in social relations. So these are the knowledge flows that can help us to understand how knowledge moves and how it is used. But of course, knowledge occurs in a certain context, and it's very often in a fluid context. So we have used the theories by Nonaka to understand this fluid context. And there's the Japanese concept of ba, where basically what they say is that ba can be thought as a shared space for emerging relationships. So this is also the philosophical concept of ba. And Nonaka has adapted this in terms of knowledge management for organizations. I mean, there's much to be said about it, but what we want to highlight here is that it's a shared place, a shared context in which this knowledge happens and is created through participants, so the actors, the individuals that are part of these interactions. So one of the interesting things that this space, this knowledge creating space does is that it allows for contradictions, and with that new knowledge also to be made. And how did we go about all of these concepts in terms of the media arts?
So the setting that we used was Mexico City. We carried 14 in-depth semi-structured interviews to new media artists. And this was in 2018. And well, we reached out to artists who use science and technology as a media to produce, store, and present their artworks, but also that they reflect on the social, political, and cultural implications of the use of these technologies. We did the sampling by a snowball method, and we did a thematical analysis of the data. I'm not controlling the computer, it's just like, can you move the slide? Yes, thank you. Yes, so what about them? So a little bit of the learnings that we had from these artists is like, well, throughout their artistic career, the interviewees have worked with many different media, okay, which makes it very difficult to categorize by the use of the media. So that was out of the question. Then they use diverse technologies to explore aesthetic and ideological inquiries. Also, something that became very evident is that only the ones that have started their career rather recently seem to be a little bit more specific about the type of media that they use. But also, or for all of them, their work is situated in the intersection of art, science, and technology. And as I mentioned before, like they do have a reflective use of these technologies, and something that becomes very, very important is interdisciplinarity. So, I mean, by the definition of media art, but also by the way they carry out their practices. So this is a quote from one of the interviewees, and well, I'm not going to read it word by word, but basically what they're expressing right now here is that, well, the importance that they give to interdisciplinarity, and they actually also give a little bit of relevance to this interdisciplinarity, not only for the arts, but also for the science. They say like, okay, it's not only art that can learn from the sciences, but also the sciences can learn from the methods of artistic production. And they reflect on the way that, well, in the end, being creative is combining different ideas. So by having ideas from many different disciplines, the creative process becomes a little bit more, well, easier and more evident. Thank you, yes. And well, by the same token, since they're very used to this interdisciplinarity, well, there is an evident willingness to share the knowledge with other people, okay, in many different ways. I mean, they can be from like a direct collaboration in a specific project that they need input from someone else, or even just by sharing information online to the public or to in specific forums that they have. And well, in the end, it all comes down to new media art to being like a very process-based practice. And this quote that we have here on the screen, it talks about, or it makes a metaphor of a lead lamp. So this example illustrates how the combination of tacit and explicit knowledge comes together in the processes in which they create art, because they say, okay, so perhaps a LED lamp is turned out in the end, but that is not the objective. It is about the process that we get to, like working collaboratively to get to that lamp to be lit up. And in order for these exchanges of information to happen and all these knowledge processes, they also identified certain traits or values that are very important for them to be part of these exchanges or to start these exchanges. And these are just some of them, and along with them, the descriptions we used. But we use like, to begin with, there has to be like an openness to share and receive knowledge, right? So it talks about the flexibility of the characters. Also having shared interests, like if they have something that they're actually interested about, then they will perhaps share a little bit more. Reliability and responsibility also became very important for them, and also respect. And with that, it goes hand in hand with trust. Affection is also very important for them, and also critical thinking. So they like not staying at the surface, but being a little bit more, going a little bit more deeper into the concepts that they use. And well, curiosity, empathy, and honesty are also traits and values that were very important for the artists we interviewed. So some of the findings that we got from this research was like, new media artists are able to create, transfer, and adopt knowledge from the interactions that they have with the people that are in their social networks. So some ideas taken from other creative content, such as fictional characters, fictional books, movies, music, they all bring down, or they all absorb tacit and explicit knowledge from all these different sources. Yes, and information and communication channels that provide very structured information are also some resources that they use. So we see this like all mix of tacit and explicit knowledge coming together.
Yes, so this explicit and tacit knowledge is also then organized into flows, and as we have seen, it can be knowledge as a solution when, for example, they apply these artists apply technical knowledge and they do their research. They also have training. So it's really about the know what, the what in this research and in the project that they are working on. Collective project most of the times, or at least with a collective collective element in it. And then we move on to more tacit forms of knowledge when we're talking about knowledge as experience and knowledge as socially created. So in knowledge as experience, we can see that they have a lot of emotions, a lot of reflection, and that there's also some formal learnings that they really internalize. And then, of course, there's the really socially created, which is much more in the interaction with other individuals in this kind of combination, negotiation processes, and different disciplines. And it's also about the know who. So it's also about these different skills and knowledge that other people have that can contribute to the project. So these are the flows, the knowledge flows where the different types of knowledge are. And this is all necessary to really come to the end product, which might not be the most important, but they still need a lot of knowledge, a lot of interactions, and it's a collective effort with a shared interest and a shared goal to get to this point. And it's such a complex and fluid reality and context that the concept of Ba can be quite interesting to look at it, because these are individuals who are, and you can see the individuals represented here. These are individuals who interact and have shared contexts. And then they have different levels of context where they interact and where knowledge is created. So these participants themselves, these actors, they create this knowledge in different ways, in different spaces, let's say, which can be formal or informal places. So the big message is that we should look at these processes as holistic and not just as one exchange or an exchange in a certain place, but it's much more fluid. The boundaries are more fluid and it's much more complex, and it does involve tacit and explicit knowledge all together in the different levels. So what would be the takeaways of the research? There will be 5 takeaways. So one of them is that personality and values are quite important in these processes. So we are not so much talking as Nonaka has in terms of organizations, but these are individuals who have their own practices, but they do work together in shared projects. And it has come out of the research that personality is very important, and values, shared values also. And this provides the basis for a shared context, which will be where knowledge creation, adoption, and transfer will occur. So the shared context is very important. And interestingly enough, the technical knowledge that we could think that is the main thing doesn't come out as the main thing, is a necessary means to get the project done, to get to the outcome, but it's only a small part of what these artists value. Another interesting takeaway is that the idea of reflection and self-reflection in the whole of the process, so since the beginning till the end, is extremely important. And there is a lot of self-awareness of knowledge, since what they want to learn, what they want to share, how they want to share it, what they would like to see shared, and how they internalize all of this. So finally, this idea of knowledge creating a place can really provide us with elements for reflecting on these complex and fluid shared common spaces where knowledge creation occurs and how it occurs, not only for organizations, but also for individuals working, for example, as is the case very often with new media artists in projects. So this is a little bit of our research, let's say a summary of our paper, and we are happy if you get in touch with us about this or any other topic. And we would be very happy to listen to your comments or questions, or very interested to see what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lénia. I'll give a little applause here. We'll give people a chance to put some questions in the chat or raise their hand. And I also need to say thank you to Freshta. This was great and well done between the two of you, co-presenting from different locations in this virtual environment. That's never easy. So thank you on that. Are there any questions that anyone would like to lead off with? If not, I can tell you, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it's interesting to hear about how important the notion of sharing is. Not just sharing of information and knowledge, but sort of sharing contexts and sharing space, and even sharing the really technical pieces, sharing code and things. It's an interesting world to walk into, especially when I go to the grocery store. There's not a lot of sharing kind of thing. It's about private property rights, and things are really strict in terms of boundaries. But it's interesting to hear the importance of sharing in this group. So any other questions? All right, so then I have an actual question in for you that I'll lead off with. And it gets to I think, a big notion of Ba in the end. And I'm wondering about, I mean, if I was to be really pushy about it, I wonder how relevant it is if we push the boundaries of space so that they're so fluid and potentially so expansive that we don't have place anymore, especially for people working in a digital realm. And if the idea that they're learning from each other, but they're learning from popular culture, they're learning from things they watch on TV, what's the space for that? What is the place? And is this really about place, or is it just the whole world is the place, and it's so holistic, it's so broad, it's not place driven? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Very relevant, especially in in this kind of environment. The interesting thing is that the initial theory of Nonaka was written in '98 when he published it. And there already talked about cyber, the cyber Ba, when it would still be a kind of concept. But of course, these days, and also his own research changed a little bit, and I think we do have to ask this question: what is the virtual doing? There is this idea of a virtual bar. What he did used so the origins of the theory did used to say that physical space was fundamental. That was the primary bar. So, we start with meeting each other in a physical space, and that's where the interaction starts and tacit knowledge starts to occur. Of course, these days with the technology, this doesn't have to happen in the same way. Although I would argue it does have a different ethos. It does lead to different types of behavior and different types of relationship. So it's not that it doesn't occur. I do think it does occur, and we are here to prove it. But it does, it's in a different way. Now, when we talk about space and place, I'm also a bit biased by a geographical approach to it, where you do have the space, and that's very often how this is conceived as space. But we do talk about place, because there are meanings, there are emotions, and there are experiences attached to it. So it's not just the space as in a physical space or even in a virtual space as such. It's much more than that. It's about the attachment. It's about the relationships that we develop in that space and making it meaningful. And I do think in that sense that it is fluid, but we do need something to make sense out of what is happening in organizations, but also especially when it's in complex and very uncertain and very fluid dynamic contexts. There's not much being said about how this happens with freelance artists that do not belong to an organization. And this is, let's say, an exploratory study to try to approach it in that way.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And I'm glad to hear that place isn't sort of restricted to just geographic place. I think it's fascinating when we think of virtual spaces and the importance that they have, or changing importance. But I think it's also particularly interested when you're looking at new media or digital media, where it's different than theater or something that's often very physically grounded in a specific place. These projects often can live entirely in the cyber, and they may not actually be grounded. And so I think that topic makes it even more interesting to think about virtual spaces and places as well. So that's fascinating. And I see Norman's got his hand up, so I'm happy to call on Norman.
Yeah, I don't, my impression, and I don't know good data on this, is that historically artists have been thought of as individualistic and not as team players of various sorts. And what's interesting here to me is that, because I've been looking at science progress and so on, and science is particularly has become very team oriented. And particularly, again, both in the physical, particularly the biological sciences, and the labs and the personality aspects of getting along together as lab mates and so on and so forth has become very important science. And I wondered whether this represents a kind of movement of that kind of culture into the artist's world. Now, it may be supported by technology or the requirements of technology and so forth, but as the way you describe it, it sounds like the Ba concept, so to speak, is different from the traditional way artists have worked, or at least many artists have worked, and particularly in the visual arts. Obviously in theater and so forth, that's sort of different. But writing, people think of as a very individualistic sort of thing, and I've always at least thought of the visual artists as individualistic, although clearly exceptions. If you read about Renoir and that group in the Paris in the 19th century, there was a group there who were very, who had a bar, so to speak, at least at one restaurant. And so I wondered if you've noticed this or if this has come up, because I was struck by your artists' reports about the way they operate and the importance of these interchanges and so forth.
Thanks, Norman. That's yeah, that's very interesting, and I mean, we could go on a whole session, several hours, just discussing some of those points because they're really very interesting. One of them would be, you know, when you refer to the 19th century, I do wonder, and this is just not necessarily from the data, but more thinking if this idea that the artist has to be, you know, in a pedestal, if this is changing, and if, you know, movements like more pop culture, more accessible democratization of arts and culture, if that is not also, and also the society that is more connected with globalization, with technology, I think all of those things have contributed to the fact that people, including artists, want to work more together. Do they have to? Some might also get to the conclusion that they have to work together, and that's the best way. But I do think there is an intrinsic idea that collaborations are better than competition, pure competitions, or that collaborations are better than simply being on your own as the artist. And it's also a very specific type of artist, I would say. So it's not all artists that are like that. And even in new media artists, there was one exception, but maybe Fereshte can also talk a little bit about how this, how these artists had their take on these shared experiences and how they work with a team.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I mean, to start with, I think the context in which new media art or media art started already like paved the path into collaboration, since it all started like in educational context. Like the first experiments with sound and image were happening in laboratories, like in labs in universities, where collaboration is were more present. Perhaps that already put like the stamp on this artistic practice to go further. And well, also something that was noticeable, and like some of the interviews mentioned it, is like in the end, like if you base your practice in the latest technology or in the latest advancement in this particular sound or this particular image, you're always going to be chasing your own tail, and you're always going to be behind. So that's why they don't rely that much interest into the technical part of it, so to say. So they, in the end, are more willing to share those things because, well, now, just as Lénia said, like everyone can learn to use whatever tools, or it's easier nowadays, right? So, and they perhaps focus a little bit more attention to other aspects, and then like, well, coming together, sharing all this knowledge becomes more important than just having the latest paint, just, you know, like the flashy blue that everyone wants. I think it may have something to do with that as well.
Yeah, and for example, it was interesting that from all the interviewees, there was one that said, no, I don't want to meet with people. Most of them said they like to go to parties, so they like to engage with other people. And he was like, no, I just do virtual. So for him, that was really so he was in all these kind of groups and chats, and they would exchange and work together, but virtually. He was not interested. He was even a bit allergic, if I can use the word, to go in that kind of environment, which I thought it was quite interesting because that was an exception. But so there are also those cases of collaborations, but still a little bit, especially when we look at technology, the idea, yes, I want to be in my corner and do my thing. I don't want to be exposed to the other in a physical. And this is where also the idea of space can be quite interesting, but it would be fine in the virtual space, which is also interesting. Interestingly enough, and maybe Norman is something to connect with. We have a PhD candidate at the moment, since now nearly 2 years, working with art and science and technology collaborations. She's specifically looking at collaborations in art, science, and technology. So maybe it's something that we can also discuss with you at some point.
Excellent. Other questions? Jeff.
Thanks, Doug. I found this really interesting, and it particularly connected in my mind with a problem that is being much thought about at the moment, certainly in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. I don't know about the States. And that is how practice knowledge in the arts can be communicated to those who weren't there in the process of its making. Because classically in research across established disciplines, it is the text output, whether that's in science or in humanities or whatever, which is the way you communicate to others the new knowledge that was created out of the research process. And one of the challenges that the creative arts in general, not just new media, creative arts in general have had, is how can they establish that the new knowledge, ways in which the new knowledge can be communicated to those who weren't present at its making or at its performance. And that is something which I think has been a big issue, particularly it's developed in the context of where you've got research evaluation systems in which arts researchers, practice researchers have to demonstrate the research knowledge they have generated. But I think it's a broader problem. And the question that I want to put to you is, what you're describing is clearly at one level distinctive to new media, but actually it's an example of a broader problem in practice arts, in how you can communicate to those who were not present at its making the new knowledge that was created. Because that, for me, I still think, I'm not a practice artist, but I still think that that's what practice arts has to do. You have to be able to communicate what that new knowledge is in a way that is separate from its production and the output itself, the creative content. And I wonder whether that was a bit for me, which I didn't get from your presentation, which I found was absolutely fascinating. But the question of this new knowledge, how is it communicated to others? Was that something you addressed at all, or which you thought was an issue?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, another great bit of food for thought. This piece of research itself, it's only about how they do it within projects. So when there's a common interest and there's a common goal. So in that sense, it's not so much, it's about the being there and not so much about communicating it to the people who are not there. So that was trying to understand how this occurs when they are interacting. On the other hand, when you ask the question, how would you communicate these practices? My kind of counter question would be, why should it be communicated? I mean, not that it wouldn't have to be, but is it because of these research panels and of these evaluations? Yeah. Would that be the main reason why we would want this knowledge to be communicated? Or are we trying to communicate something and make something explicit in terms of, so this is also where the explicit and tacit knowledge comes very much at hand, because then you have explicit knowledge, which you want to make a lot of this tacit knowledge, very often tacit, and you want to make it explicit. but that's not part of the goal of those projects.
No.
And that's not part of very often. So how do we do that? I mean, I think there are some ways in which this is done. For example, they do write it in chats, in forums or fora, in groups. So there is some kind of, explicit knowledge coming out of the interactions of the learnings, and they share it by doing that, they also create new knowledge, or they might create because they're sharing it and counteracting and adding to it. There's also the virtual spaces, so the meetings they have with each other, where that also happens. They tell stories and that goes on. There's also some who might do tutorials and videos about what they have learned.
I think that's really helpful, Lénia, because in answer to your question, why should one want to communicate it?
It's a provocative question, by the way.
Well, in part it comes, well, first of all, it's not about research evaluation processes. It's just that provoked the need to answer the question. It's about something more fundamental, and maybe it's the character of research. And you were describing it, what was in fact a knowledge creation process. And for me, and maybe you don't agree, but research, if research cannot be communicated to those who are not present at its making, then it's about creative construction of new creative content, but it isn't, by my definition, research. And yet what you were describing was a research process in which there are things to be learned that go beyond having been there and having looked at the creative content that was produced. But you actually started answering my question by saying that there were blogs, which always worries me, because when creative knowledge is communicated through text, I start worrying that people are retreating from the complexity of how creative knowledge is formed. But then there are the videos and so on. And just a final word from me, attempts have been made in the UK to try and find a way of recording the research process and making it explicit to those who weren't present, which doesn't reduce it to a linear text-based method. And that involves using platforms in which you can actually record, whether it's videos, texts, earlier versions of things, the events at which communication takes place and new things are created. And you don't even present that in a linear timeline, though you can show a timeline for those who are interested in it. So you can actually get involved in the process, even if you had nothing to do with it. And you can therefore start learning what went on in the process, which might be useful to you as a knowledge creator in a different setting. So that I think is the way, for me, the way forward. And you were beginning to point to it in your answer with these different elements. But if those were all put together for something that people could access who were not there, they might learn from it, which for me is what new knowledge needs to be about. Anyway, enough.
No, but that's interesting, because I mean, these projects, they start with research.
Yeah.
They have a lot of research involved in it, but they are creative processes.
Yeah.
But they involve so much knowledge, not only the creation of, so they create knowledge at least at the end and throughout the process, but they also transfer knowledge. They also have adoption of new knowledge. So research and the creative process go hand in hand. In this particular case, they cannot go without each other. It's very difficult because technology is changing all the time, and that's quite interesting. Maybe another thing that could help to think about this is the again, coming back to Nonaka, he has this Seki model, which talks exactly how the transfers of knowledge in an organization do. And one of them is externalization, which is how do we go from tacit to explicit knowledge. So that can be an interesting, and I think we could use that more in the arts and see how that happens, not only from the research perspective, but also because creative processes also involve a lot of knowledge. So maybe we need to think about it and create something along those lines. But maybe Fereste also wants to add something to the discussion.
Well, I mean, I definitely agree that it is a challenge, and I was just also thinking about, I mean, definitely, I agree that this process is just like, as you mentioned, in like how we can, by making explicit tacit knowledge, it becomes explicit, etc. But I was also thinking about the challenges that documentation sometimes have, and particularly with these artworks. Because I mean, even if we document the process, and this is not a straight answer, it's just like something that comes into my mind as a question, but like, even if we can document the process of the whole artistic research and everything, like the fact that perhaps we're not working with a machine that, I don't know, did something that was like a stimulus for the participants, like how does that change the experience? But I mean, it's just something that came to my mind.
Thanks.
It's all very interesting, and I think it raises some interesting things about the sort of audience learning and getting new knowledge from the work, but also obviously there's a big emphasis on the artists themselves learning. And I think the importance of reflection that you put in the very beginning of all this talk of how important it is for the artists to reflect on it, it's not just that the artists are learning over the course of their career or in making the work, they're actually learning from their own work, much like an audience person would learn from it. The parallels between that and a lot of research science aren't quite the same, but they're all very rich and interesting. And I need to stop talking and let Christian, who had put his hand up, thankfully. Why don't you weigh in here, Christian?
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you both for this really interesting presentation. It's great to hear your perspectives from across the pond on sort of emergent media arts, and especially in the Mexican, the New Mexico, sorry, in the Mexican city, Mexico City context. I'm interested to hear you talk more about the relationship of power and privilege to this process of knowledge creation, which you're describing. I'm interested to know whether you've found any correlations between sort of privileged identities among the artists you've spoken to and their approach to the production of knowledge, whether there's a correlation between the production of knowledge and the reproduction of power dynamics, and what are the limits of that correlation, in your opinion?
Fereste, do you want to answer or shall I?
As you want. Do you want to go? You can go.
So we didn't look specifically at that. So in terms of the goals of the research, they didn't aim at that. What we did see in terms of power relationships is that there are some actors who, so in this scene, so we have a very specific setting, the Mexico City, and in there you can see that some actors come back in some projects. So you see that they are quite important. There's also what we could say that what is the expression? Set trenders?
Trendsetters?
Trendsetters, thank you. the trendsetters. So you also have some of those personalities in there, especially in the older generations that have really made an important mark in what has been happening. And it's not very clear, but there is sometimes a bit of the power who has access to the resources. And so how do you get access? So sometimes it's also through the network. So it is a knowledge-driven network, but at the same time, there's also not just about knowledge, there's also these relationship of power. So it could be very interesting to look at this type of knowledge network and this see it also from the perspective of power. In terms of identities, yes, we didn't really explore that, but you do see there are some people, and there's also some types of identities that kind of thrive better in this kind of environment. And I don't think it's just Mexico City. It would be nice to reproduce this in other places, because I think part of the conclusions would be the same, because it's a global phenomenon, and new media art is quite global in that sense, and also with technology and the virtual world. Although, of course, when you are in certain contexts, physical contexts, geographical contexts, then you also have specific challenges attached to those contexts.
Yeah, I would only add, like, I mean, as Lénia said, we didn't look specifically to that. Something that became apparent when we were like reviewing the data was that those that have access to certain institutions, like that the institutions that promote new media art in general, like those tend to be the ones that are more involved into knowledge exchanges, like they are more used to like these collaborative ways of working. But yeah, that is, I think, as far as we can deduct from this. But thank you for your question, Christian.
Yeah, thanks. Norman.
Yeah, I was to go back to this discussion about the transfer of knowledge, or the various sorts. I wanted to point out that one important distinction, I think, between art and science, the object of the artist is to produce something unique. And so in some sense, the knowledge ends in the product itself. Yeah, I mean, yes, they do teaching and so on and so forth, but as far as the artist is producing a work of art, you know, we evaluate it in terms of its uniqueness in a way. It is the characteristic of that artist in a way, which is not true of science. Science is quite the opposite. When we're producing new knowledge in science, you want to communicate it because it's going to build on, science builds on stuff and so on. It's not anything unique and so on. So I think they're really quite different you know, sort of goals to science and to art. And I think that would reflect the kind of ways in which one would think about communication of knowledge of various sorts. Again, there may be a team build, art may be, a particular art thing might be the product of a team, but still it's that thing, which maybe I did, when this was going on before the big thing of a few weeks ago about the sale of Beeple's art and the effect of what was it called, non-fungible tokens, and able to make these kinds of art objects really unique, in the sense that there is an original one and others are copies, and you can distinguish and own the original. Had that been an issue in when you, I don't know, were you doing this research last year or the last few years or something? It sounds like it's something that's first of all, just been the fact of these non-fungible tokens is something that's relatively new, and still, you know, it's difficult to understand exactly how they are produced for an art object and so forth. I've been trying to understand blockchain production of various sorts, but I'm still not quite sure how you can do it and attach it to an art object.
Well, that the NFTs have been in blockchain, but now with NFTs that has come to a whole load of discussion, and we are trying still to figure out what does that really mean. I think we are all asking ourselves the question is, okay, some really embrace it like, yes, this is it, this is the revolution, and this is what the way to go forward. And others are quite skeptical in how, what does this really mean, not only for the arts, but for even other areas. But in terms of the arts, there's also the question of the even a more, if we can say, capitalist view of the arts, because then it also includes, at the same time, more democratic, because everybody should have access to it at the same time. So it's, yeah, I think there's a few different things in there. The other thing that when you were talking about the different goals of art and science made me think, indeed, one is more towards the unique. And in fact, for these artists that we have interviewed, they weren't so worried about the end product. It was really a lot. They were really focused on the process. Of course, they would be happy if that lamp would work at the end. But there is the importance was in the process, which is also interesting from an artistic perspective. And we could argue in terms of this type of art, is it specific to this type of art? Is this the way to go in the future, like you were mentioning before? But another thing is when you mentioned that there's this unique thing in art and then there's the science, but also in science you have patents, for example. So you also have this very strong idea of copyright, of intellectual property, which is becoming more and more important also in the arts. So, and that's also when NFTs are like the example you give, can be interesting to link to. So the question is, yeah, is it, isn't there also there in the intellectual property and the rights something to be said about how the artists are looking at art these days, also in terms of teams? Because it used to be maybe one person doing, for example, visual artist doing a painting, and that's it. But now you have teams, like in science, doing certain things. But in science, you also have patents. Maybe here you also have something that allows the intellectual property rights, which is yet a total other discussion.
No, I think it is another discussion. We need to have that one. I think it's really good. It's certainly topical and timely, and we certainly don't have enough time for it, but we need to get that on their agenda, because the intellectual property piece of this and how it folds into knowledge creation and creativity, especially among a group that is interested in sharing, or that's creating things that uniqueness takes a different form, a unique performance of a play or something. It looks very different than a unique process or a set of digital code that can be easily replicated. But when you start putting NFTs on these sorts of things, it starts to allow for, infinite copies of things, while still also retaining a unique ownership over maybe the original or numbered prints, essentially. And they're really fascinating things to think about going forward, especially again in a context where sharing and maybe the more private exclusive property rights isn't the dominant or the only value structure at play. And I think that these kinds of technologies might allow for more flexibility in how we approach these things. But I'm glad it was brought up, and we bounced off of it, even if we can't actually embrace it as a topic. I see we're at the hour mark and not seeing any other new questions in the chat. I think we're going to do a remarkable thing and end on time and not go over. And I want to thank everybody for joining us and for the interesting discussion and the conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it. And let's all take a moment and thank Freshta and Lénia for sharing their time and their really interesting research with all of us. So You get some silent hand claps over Zoom, and my gratitude. It's been a pleasure to meet you. Thank you all for joining, and I hope to see all of you in 2 weeks at a slightly later hour.
And thank you for this opportunity for knowledge sharing and hopefully transfer and new adoption and also creation.
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting stuff.
Thank you.